In this video, I am going to talk about the three important objects of Hibernate persistence logic development. In other video, I talked about importance of three objects programmatically. Programmatically means what? We have taken each object and we have understood the importance of each object, and we have seen how to create those objects by writing Java code, by writing Hibernate code. In this video, my focus will be mainly on giving diagrammatic representation for those objects. Whatever objects I talked, for those objects I would like to give what? Diagrammatic representation. First of all, let me recap what I have talked in other video, which I call it as a part 1 video of what? Three important objects of Hibernate persistence logic development. I talked about three important objects. What are those? Number 1, configuration object. Number 1, configuration object. So this object is useful to activate Hibernate framework and to represent in-memory metadata that is created based on what? Hibernate configuration file and mapping file information. Hibernate configuration file and Hibernate mapping file information. Right. Number 2, session factory object. This object contains entire data that is collected from configuration object. So configuration object's own data regarding framework, processor, the setup of the system, that information, plus configuration object represents what? In-memory metadata of both XML files. That data, both data is still maintained, and it is immutable object. Once the data is set to this object, we cannot modify the data, and its main purpose is acting as a factory to create the session objects. It's a factory to create the session object. That's why it is called session factory. That's why it is called what? Session factory. Session factory. So it's a factory to create session object. That's why it is called session factory. Fine. And moreover, it also represents a JDBC connection pool where set of JDBC connection objects are available. And number 3, session object. It's the main object here which opens session with the database software through Hibernate framework. And this is the object using which we give objects based persistence instructions to Hibernate framework. I want to ask Hibernate framework, take this object and save the object. That means take the record data of the object and insert into table as a record. We give this kind of persistence instructions to Hibernate framework using what? Session object only. So session object is mainly base object to give this kind of persistence instructions. So these are the three important objects which I have discussed in other days class. So right now my target over here is I would like to create diagrammatic representation of what? All these objects. So let's go for, this is our Hibernate application, Java application having Hibernate persistence logic. As usually, this is our database software. As usually, no doubt, this is our what? Database software. This is what here? Java application having Hibernate persistence logic. This is our database software. This is our what? Database software. Here we got something called, first what object will be created? Configuration object will be created. Configuration object. What it will do? It will activate Hibernate framework. After that, what it will do? It will maintains in-memory metadata having the content that is collected from what? Mapping file and configuration file. So ultimately, it will start representing what here? Hibernate configuration file. Hibernate configuration file. It also contains what? Hibernate mapping file. Configuration file internally maintains name of the mapping file, and configuration object seriously represents what? Configuration object seriously locates what? Configuration file. Anyhow, inside the configuration file, name of the mapping file will be mentioned. After this, what will happen? Using this configuration object, what object will be created? Session factory object will be created. What object will be created here? Hibernate session factory object will be created. This session factory object definitely represents what? JDBC connection pool. JDBC connection pool. JDBC connection pool having set of readily available JDBC connection objects. All these are the connection objects. So this represents connection pool. It happens. So configuration object creates a session factory object. So now using this session factory object, we create what? Hibernate session object. What object here? Hibernate session object. That's it. And Hibernate session objects, so take the support of various what? Domain class objects and try to perform persistence operations on what? Database software. Directly it performs, so through Hibernate framework it will perform. Definitely it will perform through Hibernate framework. Domain class object. Here also what? Domain class object. So using session factory object, what will be done? Session object will be created. Fine, boss. So these are the three important objects and their object representation. So let's try to understand what is what. Number one, we create configuration object by using what? New operator. Configuration CFG is equal to new configuration of. At that time what happened? Inside the constructor there is a logic to bootstrap Hibernate, nothing but activating Hibernate based on the jars that are added to class path or what? Build path. And later we call what method? Configure method. We generally call what method? Configure method. This method takes a given Hibernate configuration file and also locates Hibernate mapping file, loads both the documents, checks whether they are well formed or not, and checks whether they are valid or not. If yes, it prepares what? In-memory metadata having what? Both XML files data, and returns configuration object representing both XML files data, right? Next, this is number 2. Number 3, configuration object uses build session factory method. What method here? Build session factory method. Configuration object uses what method? Build session factory method to create what? Session factory object. What this method will do? This method gathers original data that is there in configuration object regarding framework, Java setup and all the things, and also collect in-memory metadata that is represented through XML file. As part of that in-memory metadata, it uses, it collects what? JDBC properties that are there, and creates what? One connection pool. And original configuration object data and in-memory metadata, including these JDBC properties using which this connection pool is created. All these things will be placed by creating one session factory object. That's the reason we call session factory object is what? Heavy object. I repeat this. When build session factory method is called, on configuration object. When build factory session factory method is called on what? Configuration object, what happens? It collects configuration object original data, which is there about framework and Java setup and all this thing, and also collects what? In-memory metadata represented by configuration object. So as part of in-memory metadata, it uses JDBC properties and creates what? Set of connection objects in the connection pool. Fine. Now in-memory metadata of both XML file, configuration object, both these details will be dumped into what? One object, by creating one special object called what? Session factory object. That means whatever data that is there in configuration object will be dumped to what? Session factory object. And this session factory object itself also represents what? JDBC connection pool. It even represents some second level cache and other things, but mainly I would like to highlight, yes, it will not only what? Contains what? Configuration objects supplied in memory metadata and other details, it also represents what? JDBC connection pool. Fine. On this, we call, on the session factory object, we call open session method. What method here? Open session method. On session factory object we call. Session factory object collects one connection object from connection pool, okay, and using that connection object, it will open the session to database software through framework, and having that connection object, it creates and returns what? Session object. That's the reason we can say session object open session with the database software, open connection with the database software through what? Hibernate framework. So observe now, configuration object is created and configure method reads both XML files data and prepares in-memory metadata. Once build session factory method is called, it creates session factory object having the data that is collected from what? Configuration object and in-memory metadata that is there in XML file. Now when we call open session method on session factory object, okay, based on the connection object that is collected from connection pool, session object will be created, and this session object opens our connection or session with the database software through framework by using that connection object. So what is number 5? What we do, you know, we take the support of various domain class objects, and with the support of what? Hibernate session object, we pass those objects to Hibernate framework giving various persistence instruction. Hibernate internally uses JDBC code plus SQL query support and completes persistence operations on database software. For example, I want to give persistence instruction to Hibernate framework to save the object. Here we got the session object. On the session object I call save method. Save method, I give one or other domain class object with data. So save method sends that object to Hibernate framework, asking Hibernate framework to save the object. What Hibernate will do? Reads the data of the object, internally generates what? SQL query with the support of JDBC code, sends that query to database software, simply inserts the record in what? Database software, and completes what? Given persistence operation. So session object is very much base for the programmer to create what? To give various persistence instruction to Hibernate framework from Java application. So let me put all these things in the form of code, sample code. Sample code. So first of all, activate or bootstrap Hibernate framework. What is this? Configuration CFG is equal to new configuration of. Yes, it will activate. Entire logic is there in the constructor. Constructor will take care of that. Next, read both XML files data. So CFG is equal to new CFG dot configure, and just give the name and location of configuration file. Just give the name and location of what? Configuration file. That's it. Okay. Automatically it will pick up the name of the mapping file, because inside the configuration file we also maintain what? Mapping file name. So this CFZ refers to configuration object, which actually points to in-memory metadata of both XML files. Then build session factory. Build session factory. What is this? Session factory is equal to session factory is equal to CFZ dot build session factory. CFZ dot what? Build session factory. What happened? CFZ is having some Hibernate information, system setup information, also represents in-memory metadata of both XML file. That entire data now will be used while creating session factory object. Not only that, this session factory object even represents what? JDBC connection pool. Next, what is next one? Open session with the database software. Indirectly what? Create session object. Create what? Session object. Here what we do? So we session SCS is equal to what is that? Factory dot open session of. Yes, if you want to follow coding standards, you can follow. If you write entire code in a method, it's better to declare what? All these local variables or reference variable at the top of the method declaration and use them throughout the application. Why are you not handling exception handling? Exceptions. Hibernate throws what? Unchecked exception. So exception handling is what? Optional. But let us worry about it. Factory dot open session. Session factory is a factory to create session. We are asking second factory to give one session object. Gives it. How does it gives? It collects one connection object from connection pool. Having that connection object, it creates and returns session object. That's the reason session object is able to open session or what? Connection with the database software through Hibernate framework. So lastly what? Perform persistence operation. Here I am not writing complete technical code. I just want to say, as a programmer you can do everything through objects. Let me prove that. Session dot save object. What is this object? Domain class object with data. What is that object here? Domain class object with data. So point is very simple here. When we call session.save method giving domain class object with data, this object will be passed to framework. Framework collects the object data, generate SQL query with the support of JDBC code, sends that query to database software. Due to this what? Record will be saved. Observe, no insert query. As a programmer, I am giving persistence instruction to what? Hibernate framework in the form of what? Object. If you observe very carefully, whatever activities we have done the diagram, same thing are reflecting here. What is number one in the diagram? Creation of configuration object to activate Hibernate framework. This line talks about this. Calling configure method and getting what? In-memory metadata of both XML file. This line talks about that. What is number three? Calling build session factory method and building what? Session factory object having data that is there in what? Configuration object. So this line is what? This. What is number four? Calling open session method and creating what? Session object based on session factory object. After all, session factory is factory to create the session object. That is number four. What is number five? Using session object and providing what? Persistence instruction to framework through objects, through domain class objects. Yes. So this is number five. Not only save method, we have other methods also. Load method is there to load the object. Delete method is there to delete the object. Deleting object means deleting the record that is there in the table. And update method is there to update the object. So lot of methods are there. We have everything we can give in the form of objects. We can give instruction to what? Hibernate framework in the form of what? Objects. So in previous video I talked code representation, I talked various points about these objects. In this video I have mainly concentrated to present the same discussion in the diagrammatic representation.